Maya Lawson was a name that very few people in the world would recognize, and that was by design. As one of the most high-ranking intelligence officers in the CIA, she specialized in operations so classified that even most government officials weren't aware of her existence. She carried herself with the quiet assurance of someone who had seen and done far more than anyone could imagine, but she never flaunted her authority. That wasn't her style. Maya had learned long ago that power was most effective when it wasn't broadcasted. The key to her success was blending in, appearing unremarkable, and controlling situations before anyone realized what was happening. Her life revolved around secrecy, calculated moves, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. This evening, however, Maya allowed herself a rare moment of stepping into the public eye. She had chosen to attend a high-profile charity gala held at a luxurious hotel downtown. Her presence there wasn't personal. She wasn't someone who enjoyed social events or mingling with elites. It was a matter of necessity. The gala was being used as a front for an international transaction involving sensitive information, and Maya's mission was to intercept the individuals involved. It was a simple enough operation on paper, though Maya knew that simplicity on paper rarely translated into reality. Dressed in an elegant but understated black evening gown and wearing minimal makeup, she moved through the opulent halls of the hotel with the air of a woman who belonged, yet who invited no questions. Her evening had been proceeding smoothly, at least until she arrived at the registration desk to pick up her identification bracelet for the gala. The young woman behind the desk looked nervous, flipping through her tablet with increasing panic. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but your name isn't on the list," she said, her voice quivering slightly as she avoided making eye contact. Maya's expression remained calm, though her mind immediately began analyzing the situation. She had confirmed her alias for this event weeks ago. The name should have been there. Either someone had tampered with the guest list, or the event organizers had made a serious mistake. "Double-check," Maya said, her tone even but firm. The woman nodded hastily, her fingers darting across the screen, but after a few seconds, she shook her head. "I'm really sorry, ma'am. I'll call my supervisor to sort this out." Maya gave a short nod, though her instincts were already on high alert. As the woman turned to make the call, Maya felt the weight of someone's gaze on her. Subtly scanning her surroundings, her eyes landed on a uniformed police officer standing near the entrance. He wasn't looking at her like a man on routine duty. He was studying her, his narrowed eyes and tense posture giving away his suspicion. Officer Jason Ward had been assigned to monitor the gala, though he'd spent most of his shift stewing in his own dissatisfaction. He'd been on the force for nearly a decade, and his career had plateaued in ways that frustrated him to no end. He was good at finding reasons to stop people, especially those who didn't fit the image of the neighborhoods he patrolled. For Ward, tonight's event was an opportunity to assert authority in a room full of people he considered above their station. When he saw Maya, a black woman in an expensive dress, standing alone at the registration desk, his suspicions kicked into overdrive. She looked too self-assured, too composed, and most importantly, too out of place for his liking. As the minutes ticked by, Ward's suspicion turned to action. He approached the desk, his footsteps deliberate and heavy, meant to draw attention. Maya noticed him immediately but didn't react, continuing to focus on the receptionist. Ward didn't like being ignored. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his tone carrying a thinly veiled edge of authority. The receptionist looked relieved to see him. "Officer, this guest's name isn't showing up in our system. I'm trying to resolve it, but it might take a minute," she explained quickly. Ward's eyes flicked to Maya, and he gave her a once-over that was anything but professional. "Ma'am," he said, his voice sharp now, "do you have any proof of invitation? or ID that matches your reason for being here?" Maya turned to him, her expression blank but her gaze steady. "And you are?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. Ward's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being questioned, least of all by someone he'd already decided was suspicious. "I'm Officer Ward, and I'm asking the questions here," he snapped. "Now, do you have identification or not?" The receptionist hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the tension building between the two. "Officer, I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding," she interjected, but Ward raised a hand to silence her. "I'll handle this," he said curtly, his eyes still locked on Maya. For a moment, the two of them stared at each other in silence. Ward expected her to back down, to show some sign of nervousness or compliance. Instead, Maya simply raised an eyebrow, her expression one of mild boredom. "Officer," she said finally, "I suggest you think very carefully about how you proceed. This situation is not what you think it is." Ward's temper flared at her calm defiance. "Oh, I think I know exactly what this is," he said, stepping closer. "You're trying to pass yourself off as someone you're not, and I'm not going to let you walk in here and pull whatever scam you've got planned. Now, let's make this easy, or I'll have to escort you off the premises." Maya tilted her head slightly, as though considering his words. "If you're trying to provoke me, Officer Ward, it won't work. But if you really want to escalate this, by all means, go ahead. Just don't say I didn't warn you." Her voice was still quiet, but there was a weight to it now, a sense of something far larger and more dangerous lurking just beneath the surface. Ward took another step closer, his hand resting on the baton at his belt. "Is that a threat?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly. By now, a few guests had begun to take notice, glancing over at the scene with varying degrees of curiosity and concern. Maya remained unfazed. "No, officer," she replied. "It's advice. Very good advice, which I recommend you take while you still can." The receptionist, now visibly anxious, tried again to intervene. "Officer, I really don't think." Ward cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Stay out of this," he barked, his eyes never leaving Maya. For him, this was no longer about procedure or suspicion. This was personal. He was determined to put her in her place, to make her understand that her confidence and composure wouldn't shield her from him. Maya, however, had already analyzed him down to the last detail. His anger, his posture, the way his hand twitched toward his belt, it all painted a picture of a man who craved control, but was dangerously impulsive. She knew exactly what kind of person she was dealing with, and she knew how to handle him. The only question was how far she would have to go. For now, she simply waited, her expression unreadable, as the tension between them continued to mount. Officer Ward stood a step too close to Maya, his presence looming with a weight he clearly intended to be intimidating. His hand remained on his baton, fingers twitching slightly, as though itching for her to make a wrong move. Maya had seen men like him before, countless times in her career. Men who mistook their uniform for absolute authority, who thrived on the fear they could instill in others. But she wasn't afraid, and that seemed to irritate him even more. The receptionist at the desk had backed away, clearly overwhelmed by the escalating tension. Ward's voice dropped to a lower, more menacing tone as he said, "Let me explain something to you, ma'am. When a police officer asks you for identification, you show it. Unless, of course, you have something to hide. So let's not make this harder than it has to be." He straightened his posture, his chest puffing out slightly, as though that would add weight to his words. Maya met his gaze evenly, her expression calm and detached. "Officer, I've already explained that there's been a mistake with the registration list. I've contacted the necessary parties to resolve it. Until then, there's no law that requires me to carry an invitation to a private event, and as for identification, I've given you no reason to demand it. So, I suggest you step back and let the staff handle their error." Ward's lips curled into a sneer, his irritation bubbling into outright hostility. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he said, his tone laced with contempt. "Walking in here like you own the place, acting like the rules don't apply to you. I've dealt with your type before, always trying to talk your way out of trouble instead of just cooperating. But I don't fall for games like that. Not tonight." Maya's eyes narrowed slightly, a subtle shift that only someone as observant as Ward might have caught. Her voice, however, remained level. "Officer, I'm not playing a game. I'm simply stating facts. I've done nothing wrong. And if you truly believe otherwise, I suggest you follow proper protocol and call for backup or a supervisor. Otherwise, I'm going to consider this harassment." The word harassment hung in the air like a loaded weapon, and Ward's jaw tightened. The growing audience around them murmured softly, sensing the conflict brewing into something much larger. A few people had discreetly pulled out their phones, though most seemed hesitant to intervene directly. "I don't need backup to deal with you," Ward snapped, his voice louder now, carrying across the lobby. "You're not as untouchable as you think you are. So, unless you want me to drag you out of here in cuffs, I suggest you hand over your ID and explain what you're really doing here." Maya tilted her head slightly, studying him with the quiet intensity of a predator assessing its prey. "Drag me out in cuffs," she repeated, her voice soft but cutting. "You're escalating this far beyond what's necessary, Officer Ward. You've made assumptions about me based on what exactly? My appearance? My confidence? My presence here? You're projecting a narrative that doesn't exist, and I'm advising you to reconsider." Ward's face flushed red, a mix of anger and embarrassment. "Don't lecture me," he barked. "You think you're better than everyone else in here? You think you can talk circles around me and walk away without consequences? That's not how this works, not tonight." Without waiting for a response, Ward reached out and grabbed Maya's arm, his grip firm and unyielding. "Enough of this," he growled. "You're coming with me until we get this sorted out. Maybe a night in a holding cell will help you find some respect." The second his hand made contact with her arm, Maya's body moved instinctively. She twisted her wrist sharply, breaking his grip with ease, and stepped back out of his reach. Her movement was fluid and precise, the kind of reflex that spoke of years of training. For a moment, Ward looked stunned, his confidence rattled by how effortlessly she had countered him. "Don't touch me," Maya said, her voice cold now, her calm veneer cracking just enough to reveal the steel beneath. "You have no authority to detain me, no probable cause, and no justification for putting your hands on me. Stand down." But Ward wasn't listening. The embarrassment of being physically outmaneuvered in front of a growing audience only fueled his anger. He stepped forward again, this time reaching for his baton. "That's resisting an officer," he snarled. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Maya didn't flinch. Her stance shifted slightly, her weight evenly distributed, ready for whatever came next. Her voice dropped lower, quieter, but somehow even more commanding. "Officer Ward, I'm giving you one last chance. Stop this now or I promise you'll regret it." Ward hesitated for a fraction of a second, but his ego refused to let him back down. With a quick motion, he drew his baton and raised it threateningly. The gasps from the onlookers were audible, and some of them began to step back, sensing the situation spiraling out of control. Maya's mind worked faster than most people's could comprehend. She calculated the angle of his stance, the weight of the baton, the trajectory of his likely strike, and then she moved. In one swift motion, she stepped into his space, her hand shooting up to intercept his wrist. She twisted sharply, forcing him to drop the baton with a pained grunt, and kicked it away before he could recover. The entire encounter lasted less than 2 seconds, but it felt like an eternity to those watching. Ward stumbled back, cradling his wrist, his face a mask of shock and fury. "What the hell are you?" he spat, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. Maya straightened, her expression unreadable. "I'm someone you don't want to provoke," she said simply. Her voice was calm again, as though nothing had happened, but there was a deadly edge to her words that silenced even the murmurs of the crowd. Ward's hand hovered near his radio, his instincts torn between calling for backup and doubling down on his mistake. He had never encountered someone like her before, someone who could dismantle his authority so thoroughly without even breaking a sweat. And yet, his pride refused to let him walk away. "You're under arrest," he said finally, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. "I don't care who you think you are. Assaulting an officer is a felony, and you're going to pay for this." Maya raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharp enough to cut through steel. "You think this is assault?" she asked, her tone almost amused. That was restraint. "If I wanted to hurt you, Officer Ward, you'd know it." Before he could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the lobby. A group of men in black suits entered the building, their movements precise and coordinated. Their presence immediately commanded attention, and the tension in the air shifted. They weren't security, and they weren't here for the gala. These men were something else entirely. Ward's face paled as one of the men approached him, flashing a badge so quickly that only Maya recognized it for what it was: a federal agency insignia. "Officer Ward," the man said, his tone clipped and professional. "Step aside." Now, Ward opened his mouth to argue, but was silenced by the man's glare. Reluctantly, he lowered his hand from his radio and stepped back, his confusion and frustration written all over his face. The man turned to Maya, his expression softening slightly. "Agent Lawson," he said, inclining his head in a gesture of respect. "Apologies for the delay. We've secured the perimeter. You're clear to proceed." Maya nodded, her composure unshaken. "Thank you," she said simply, before turning back to Ward. "You see, officer, there's a difference between authority and power. You have one, I have the other, and tonight you learned the cost of forgetting that." Ward stood frozen as Maya walked past him, her steps as steady and confident as they had been from the start. For the first time in his career, he felt truly powerless, and the weight of his mistake pressed down on him like a crushing tide. Officer Ward stood motionless, his mind a jumbled mess of humiliation and rage, as Maya walked away with her composed, deliberate stride. Her final words echoed in his ears, louder and more damning with every second that passed. "There's a difference between authority and power. You have one. I have the other." He clenched his fists, the humiliation clawing at him like a physical wound. People were staring now, their eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and disdain. He could feel their judgment bearing down on him, and it stoked the fire of his bruised ego. He wasn't going to let her get away with this. Not without a fight. Ignoring the men in suits who had just intervened, Ward reached for his radio with shaky hands, muttering into it. "This is Officer Ward. I need backup at the Royal Garden Hotel immediately. Suspect is resisting detention and has assaulted an officer. Situation is escalating." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them, but they were his only recourse to regain a shred of control. He ignored the glances from the federal agents, who exchanged knowing looks but didn't immediately stop him. One of them stepped forward, about to speak, but Ward raised a hand sharply. "I'm handling this," he snapped, his voice rising. "This is still my jurisdiction." Maya, hearing the commotion behind her, stopped mid-step. She didn't turn around immediately but instead let out a slow, controlled breath, calculating her next move. She could feel the room's energy shift again, the weight of Ward's desperation clinging to the air like static before a storm. When she finally turned, her face was unreadable, her eyes narrowing slightly as she saw him reaching for his weapon belt. "Officer Ward," she said calmly, her voice cutting through the low murmurs in the room like a blade. "If you don't stop right now, this will escalate into something you cannot undo." Ward's face was flushed red, the veins in his neck bulging as he pointed a finger at her. "I don't take orders from you," he shouted. "You assaulted me. You're under arrest, and you're not walking out of here until I say so." The room fell into a stunned silence. Even the men in suits, clearly accustomed to handling tense situations, hesitated for a moment, watching to see how Maya would respond. But Maya didn't flinch. She took a single step forward, her posture relaxed, but her presence commanding enough to make Ward instinctively step back. "Let me be very clear, officer," she began, her voice steady, calm, and utterly devoid of fear. "I don't care about your bruised ego, and I certainly don't care about whatever false narrative you're trying to build here. What I do care about is preventing you from making a mistake that will cost you far more than your badge. Now, take your hand off your weapon, lower your voice, and walk away. That's your only option." Ward's hand wavered over his holstered taser, his mind racing. He felt cornered, his authority slipping further and further out of his grasp with each passing second. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. With a sudden burst of motion, he unholstered the taser, aiming it squarely at Maya's chest. "You think you're untouchable," he snarled, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and adrenaline. "Let's see how untouchable you are now." The gasp from the onlookers was audible, but Maya's expression didn't change. She remained rooted in place, her eyes locked on Ward with an intensity that made him hesitate for a fraction of a second. That hesitation was all she needed. As Ward fired, Maya moved. Her body shifted with precision and speed that seemed almost unnatural, sidestepping the dart with a fluid motion that left the audience in stunned silence. The taser's electrodes struck the wall behind her, sparking harmlessly before falling to the floor. Maya, now standing to the side, tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing, as if she were calculating her next move. "That was your second mistake," she said quietly, her tone colder now, laced with the kind of authority that made even the federal agents pause. "You're out of your depth, Officer Ward. Stand down." But Ward was beyond reason. His humiliation had turned into blind rage, and he charged at her, abandoning any pretense of control. With a roar, he lunged forward, his hands reaching out as if to physically overpower her. The crowd gasped again, a few people even shouting for him to stop, but it was too late. Maya reacted instantly. As Ward closed the distance, she stepped into his attack, using his momentum against him. Her arm shot out, grabbing his wrist in a vice-like grip, and with a sharp twist, she forced him to spin around, his back now exposed to her. In one fluid motion, she swept his legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground with a heavy thud. The sound echoed through the lobby, followed by an eerie silence. Ward groaned in pain, his body sprawled awkwardly on the polished marble floor. Maya stepped back, her stance relaxed but ready, her eyes scanning the room for any potential threats. The federal agents finally moved, stepping forward to intervene, but Maya raised a hand, stopping them in their tracks. "Let him get up," she said simply, her voice carrying an air of finality that made it clear she was still in control. Ward struggled to his feet, his face contorted with a mix of pain and fury. His uniform was disheveled, his dignity in tatters, but he refused to give up. "You're under arrest," he shouted again, his voice hoarse but still defiant. "Do you hear me? You're..." Enough, Maya interrupted, her voice sharp and commanding. "This isn't about law enforcement anymore, Officer Ward. This is about your ego. You've already lost. The only question now is how much more damage you want to do to yourself before you accept that." Ward froze, her words cutting through the fog of his rage like a scalpel. He looked around the room, seeing the faces of the onlookers, some shocked, some disgusted, some openly recording the scene with their phones. The realization of just how far he'd gone began to sink in, but his pride wouldn't let him admit defeat. Not yet. "You think you're above the law," he muttered, his voice trembling. "You think you can do whatever you want just because you've got people in suits backing you up. But I'm not scared of you. I'm not backing down." Maya sighed, a flicker of something almost resembling pity crossing her face. "You should be," she said quietly, "because you have no idea who I am or what I'm capable of, and if you keep pushing, you're going to find out the hard way." Before Ward could respond, the man in the black suit who had spoken earlier stepped forward again, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Officer Ward," he said, his tone icy. "This is your final warning. Step down, or you'll be removed from the premises. And trust me, you do not want to escalate this further." Ward hesitated, his eyes darting between Maya and the federal agent. His breathing was heavy, his mind racing with indecision. Finally, he took a step back, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Maya didn't respond. She simply turned and walked away, her composure unshaken, her steps steady and deliberate. The federal agents followed her, their presence a silent reminder of the power she wielded. As she disappeared through the doors leading to the private area of the hotel, the crowd slowly began to disperse, their whispers filling the space Ward had once commanded. He stood there alone, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a crushing tide. For the first time in his career, he felt small, powerless, and utterly defeated. As the tension of the confrontation ebbed, the luxury hotel lobby began to return to its usual hum of murmured conversations and polite activity, though the air still felt heavy with the aftermath of what had just occurred. Officer Ward stood frozen in place, fists clenched tightly at his sides. His humiliation was suffocating, but his mind was spinning far faster than his pride could process. Every second that passed felt like an eternity as he grappled with the undeniable fact that he had just been publicly outmaneuvered, and by a black woman who hadn't even raised her voice or broken a sweat. The reality stung more than the ache in his wrist from where she had expertly twisted it. She had dismantled his authority piece by piece, and it was clear to everyone who watched. But Ward wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. His pride wouldn't allow him to let things stand as they were. He couldn't let her walk away unscathed. Not her. Not tonight. His eyes flicked toward the entrance where Maya had disappeared moments earlier, flanked by the cold, imposing presence of federal agents. He didn't know who she was, but the way they addressed her, Agent Lawson, hinted at a level of importance that went beyond anything Ward could comprehend. And yet, that only made it worse. She hadn't just embarrassed him. She had rendered him insignificant. Ward pulled out his radio, his voice sharp and clipped as he called for reinforcements. "This is Officer Ward. I need additional units at the Royal Garden Hotel immediately. Potential suspect in an ongoing investigation, possible federal impersonation. I repeat, request immediate backup." The dispatcher responded with a hesitant acknowledgement, sensing the strain in his tone but refraining from questioning him. Ward had always been good at framing his calls to sound just urgent enough to avoid scrutiny. He tucked the radio back into its clip and squared his shoulders, attempting to regain some semblance of control. He ignored the judgmental stares of the hotel staff and guests who had witnessed his outburst, focusing instead on the plan forming in his mind. If she thought she could humiliate him and walk away, she was mistaken. He would find out exactly who she was and what she was doing here, and if it meant bending a few rules along the way, so be it. Maya, meanwhile, had moved beyond the lobby into the restricted access conference area of the hotel, where the charity gala was taking place. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. Here, everything was polished and pristine, with waitstaff weaving between elegantly dressed guests holding crystal glasses of champagne. The lighting was warm and subdued, casting a golden glow over the room. To an outsider, it would seem like a picture of opulence and civility, but Maya's trained eye picked up the undercurrents of tension beneath the surface. This event wasn't just a social gathering, it was a carefully orchestrated stage for deals and transactions that were meant to go unnoticed by the general public. And she wasn't here for the charity. As she moved through the crowd, Maya's mind remained laser-focused on the task at hand. The confrontation with Ward hadn't rattled her, not in the way he intended, at least. If anything, it had only sharpened her resolve. She was used to distractions, to obstacles that came in the form of fragile egos and misplaced authority. Ward was just another example of the kind of small-mindedness she'd learned to navigate with precision and efficiency. Still, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that his interference wasn't entirely coincidental. Something about his persistence felt deliberate, as if someone had been feeding him just enough information to keep him on edge. Her earpiece crackled softly, and a familiar voice came through. "Agent Lawson, status update." It was her handler, a man known only as Bishop, a voice she trusted implicitly, though she'd never seen his face. "I'm inside," she replied quietly, her tone measured. "No significant delays, but we had a minor complication in the lobby. Local law enforcement overstepping their jurisdiction. Situation neutralized." There was a brief pause before Bishop responded. "Understood. Keep your guard up. There's been chatter about a potential external breach. We're monitoring." Copy that, Maya said, her gaze scanning the room as she continued to move. She was careful not to linger in one place too long, blending seamlessly with the crowd. To anyone watching, she looked like just another guest, graceful, confident, and entirely unremarkable. But every step she took was deliberate, every glance calculated. She wasn't here to mingle, she was hunting. Back in the lobby, Ward's reinforcements had begun to arrive. 2 squad cars pulled up to the hotel entrance, their lights flashing discreetly, but without the sirens. 3 additional officers stepped inside, their expressions neutral as they approached Ward. One of them, Officer Ramirez, raised an eyebrow as he noticed Ward's disheveled appearance and the tension still radiating from him. "What's going on?" Ward Ramirez asked, his tone cautious. He had worked with Ward long enough to know that his instincts weren't always as sharp as he believed. Ward's jaw tightened as he gestured toward the entrance Maya had used. "We've got a situation with a suspect. Claims to be some kind of federal agent, but I'm not buying it. She resisted arrest, assaulted me, and disappeared into the back with some suits who think they can override local authority. We need to get her out here and figure out who she really is." Ramirez frowned. "Federal agents? Are you sure? You realize what kind of trouble we could be stepping into if you're wrong about this?" "I'm not wrong," Ward snapped. "Just back me up on this, all right? We're not letting her walk out of here without answers." Reluctantly, Ramirez nodded, motioning for the other officers to follow. Together, they moved toward the conference area, their presence drawing curious glances from hotel staff and guests alike. Ward's heart pounded in his chest as they approached the restricted entrance, his determination fueled by the growing certainty that this was his chance to reclaim control. Inside the gala, Maya had zeroed in on her target, a middle-aged man with graying hair and an unassuming demeanor, standing near the edge of the room. He was speaking quietly with another guest, their body language betraying the seriousness of their conversation. Maya adjusted the angle of her approach, positioning herself just close enough to overhear snippets of their exchange without drawing attention to herself. Timeline moved up. We can't afford any delays, the man was saying, his tone low but urgent. The package needs to be secured by tonight, or we risk exposure. The other man, younger and visibly nervous, nodded quickly. Understood. I'll make the call as soon as the event wraps up. Are we sure the transfer point is secure? Absolutely, the older man replied. But we need to move carefully. Too many eyes here tonight. Maya's mind processed the information rapidly, piecing together the fragments of their conversation and matching them with the intelligence she'd received prior to the operation. The package they referred to was likely the classified data she was here to intercept, a digital payload containing sensitive information that could compromise national security if it fell into the wrong hands. She took a step closer, ready to intervene, when her earpiece crackled again. Lawson, heads up Bishop's voice warned. You've got company. Local PD just entered the conference area. Looks like your friend from the lobby brought reinforcements. Maya suppressed a sigh, her expression remaining neutral as she adjusted her position to avoid drawing attention. Acknowledged, she murmured. I'll handle it. Across the room, Ward and his team had just entered, their presence immediately disrupting the carefully curated atmosphere of the gala. Guests turned to stare, their conversations halting as the officers scanned the crowd with narrowed eyes. Ward's gaze locked onto Maya almost immediately, and his face twisted into a grim smile of satisfaction. There she is, he muttered to Ramirez. Let's move. But as Ward took his first step toward her, a man in a black suit intercepted him, his expression cold and unyielding. This is a federal operation, the man said flatly. You're out of your jurisdiction. Turn around and leave. Ward bristled, his temper flaring once again. I don't take orders from you, he snapped. She's a suspect in an active investigation, and I'm bringing her in. The man's eyes narrowed, and his tone turned icy. You don't understand what you're walking into, officer. Stand down or face the consequences. But Ward wasn't listening. His focus was entirely on Maya, who now stood motionless, her gaze locked on him with an unsettling calm. In that moment he realized he wasn't just dealing with an ordinary suspect. And yet, his pride wouldn't let him back down. Not now, not ever. The atmosphere in the gala hall had shifted from one of polished elegance to a charged tension that hung thick in the air. Officer Ward stood in a sea of opulent gowns and tailored tuxedos, his hand hovering near his belt as though he were preparing for a confrontation that only he seemed determined to escalate. Around him, the soft murmur of startled conversations began to ripple through the crowd, the guests unsure of whether they were witnessing the unfolding of a serious incident or simply the antics of an overzealous officer. Ward's eyes were locked on Maya, his face a mask of barely contained rage and determination. Maya, in stark contrast, stood perfectly still. Her calm demeanor hadn't wavered once, even as Ward's reinforcements filed into the room behind him, each officer glancing uncertainly at the luxurious setting that clashed so starkly with the escalating situation. She could feel every set of eyes on her, from the guests to the federal agents, who were still holding their ground and watching the scene with quiet intensity. But Maya wasn't thinking about the crowd or even the spectacle Ward was creating. Her mind was focused entirely on the mission, the reason she was here, the target she had identified, and the critical need to prevent the transfer of sensitive information. Ward was a distraction, a dangerous one, but she had no intention of letting him derail her. Ward took a step forward, his boots clicking sharply against the marble floor. I said you're not walking out of here, he barked, his voice echoing through the room with an authority that was quickly wearing thin. This is your last chance. Surrender now, or I'll make sure you regret it. Maya's gaze remained locked on him, steady and unflinching. She didn't need to say anything to convey her disdain for his threats, and that silence seemed to provoke him even further. His hand moved to his radio, and he spoke into it in a low, clipped tone. "Officer Ward, suspect is resisting. Requesting immediate backup at my location. I need all available units." The words carried an air of finality, as if he truly believed reinforcements would tip the scales in his favor. But Maya knew better. The more he pushed, the deeper he dug his own grave. She allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible sigh before speaking, her voice cutting through the murmurs around them with icy precision. "You're making a fool of yourself, Officer Ward," she said, each word measured and deliberate. "And the worst part is, you don't even realize it. This isn't a game you can win." Ward's face flushed red, his jaw tightening as his fingers curled into fists. He was losing control, and he knew it. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, his pride now fully eclipsing any sense of logic or reason. "You don't get to tell me what I can and can't do," he spat, his voice trembling with anger. "I don't care who you think you are. You don't run this show, I do." Maya's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time her voice took on an edge of steel. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she said softly, her words carrying a weight that silenced even the murmurs of the crowd. "Walk away now. And this ends here. Keep pushing, and I guarantee you'll regret it." Ward didn't answer. His hand dropped to his belt, and in one swift motion he drew his baton, holding it tightly as he stepped closer to her. The crowd gasped audibly, some guests moving back instinctively, creating a wide berth around the confrontation. One of the federal agents made a move to intervene, but Maya raised a hand subtly, stopping him in his tracks. Her eyes remained fixed on Ward, her calm unbroken. "I warned you," she said simply, and then he swung. The baton sliced through the air with a speed and force that left no room for doubt he wasn't holding back. But Maya was faster. Her body moved with the kind of precision and grace that only came from years of training, sidestepping his strike effortlessly. Before Ward could recover, she closed the distance between them, her hand shooting out to grab his wrist in an iron grip. With a single, practiced motion, she twisted his arm, forcing him to drop the baton, which clattered loudly to the floor. The next second was a blur of movement. Maya stepped behind him, her other hand pressing firmly between his shoulder blades as she forced him forward, his balance completely thrown off. He stumbled, his knees hitting the marble floor with a heavy thud, and a sharp grunt of pain escaped his lips. She held him there, her grip unyielding, her voice low and deadly calm. "You should have listened," she said, her tone devoid of emotion. "But your arrogance wouldn't let you." The room was silent. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the other officers who had followed Ward into the room stood frozen, unsure of what to do or how to process what they were seeing. Ward, the man who had spent years enforcing his authority with an iron fist, was now on his knees, utterly powerless. One of the federal agents finally stepped forward, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "Agent Lawson," he said carefully, his tone a mix of respect and caution. "Do you want us to take over from here?" Maya didn't look at him. Her focus remained entirely on Ward, her grip on his wrist unrelenting. For a brief moment she considered her options. She could end it here, let the agents handle the fallout, and move on with the mission. But something about the way Ward had pushed, the sheer audacity of his actions, made her hesitate. This wasn't just about him. This was about sending a message not just to him, but to everyone watching. She released his wrist suddenly, stepping back as he crumpled to the floor. He clutched his arm, his face twisted in pain and humiliation, but he didn't get up. Maya stood over him, her expression unreadable. "Get him out of here," she said finally, her voice cold and detached. "He's done enough damage for one night." The federal agents moved swiftly, two of them stepping forward to grab Ward by the arms and haul him to his feet. He struggled weakly against their grip, his pride refusing to let him go quietly, but they didn't give him a choice. As they dragged him toward the exit, the crowd parted like water, their expressions a mix of shock, awe, and something that looked almost like satisfaction. Maya turned her attention back to the room, her gaze sweeping over the remaining officers who had come with Ward. "You have a choice," she said, her voice carrying across the space with quiet authority. "Follow him, or stay out of my way. Either way, this ends now." One by one, the officers exchanged uneasy glances before lowering their heads and stepping back. None of them dared to challenge her. With the situation under control, Maya turned to the lead federal agent, who nodded at her in silent acknowledgement. "I'll handle the rest," she said, her tone softer now but no less firm. "Make sure he understands what happens when you cross the line." The agent smirked faintly. "Oh, he'll understand. Trust me." Maya didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked away, her steps measured and deliberate as she moved deeper into the gala, her focus returning to the mission at hand. The guests, still stunned by what they had witnessed, parted to let her pass, their whispers following her like a trail of smoke. Behind her, Ward was dragged out of the building, his protests growing weaker with every step. By the time he reached the waiting squad car, his voice was little more than a defeated mumble. The officers who had once followed him without question now avoided his gaze, their loyalty evaporating in the face of his disgrace. As the car door slammed shut behind him, Ward slumped in the back seat, his mind racing. He had lost. Completely, utterly, and undeniably lost. But even as the reality of his failure sank in, a dark seed of resentment began to take root in his heart. He wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The room settled into an uneasy stillness after Ward was dragged out. The murmurs of the guests, though still present, became quieter, filled with apprehension and disbelief. Maya remained in control, her movements calculated and precise, yet her mind was racing. She had dealt with men like Ward countless times in her career, but this felt different. His desperation, his reckless determination to assert dominance, wasn't just about a bruised ego, it was a symptom of something larger. Something about his persistence gnawed at her. He wasn't acting alone, at least not entirely. There was too much coincidence in his timing, his presence, and his actions, and coincidence rarely existed in her world. She navigated the crowd with quiet efficiency, her sharp eyes scanning for anomalies. The target, the man she'd been observing earlier, had shifted further into the room, now seated at a private table, speaking with the same nervous younger man. Maya's instincts sharpened, her body tensing as she closed the distance between them. Whatever was being discussed now had to be the culmination of what she'd overheard earlier. Time was running out. Bishop's voice crackled in her ear. "Lawson, status, target is stationary," she replied quietly, her lips barely moving. "Engaging now." "Be careful," Bishop warned. Ward's little stunt might set off a chain reaction. "We've picked up chatter about a potential third party. Unknown players could already be in the room." Maya didn't respond. She didn't need to. The warning only reinforced what she already suspected. She adjusted her approach, positioning herself near a decorative column that allowed her to blend into the crowd while maintaining a clear view of the target. The older man, calm and composed, was gesturing subtly to the younger one, whose nervousness had only increased. They exchanged a small package, a sleek black device that looked unassuming, but which Maya immediately recognized as a custom data drive. Her heartbeat quickened, though her face remained expressionless. This was it. The payload. The culmination of weeks of surveillance and preparation. If the drive left the building in the wrong hands, the consequences would be catastrophic. The contents weren't just sensitive, they were volatile, capable of upending entire networks of national security. She couldn't let it leave. As she prepared to make her move, she caught something in her peripheral vision, a glint of metal, a shift in movement that didn't belong. Her eyes flicked to the side, and her stomach dropped. Two men, dressed in casual suits that did little to mask their predatory posture, were weaving through the crowd with purpose. Their attention wasn't on the gala or its guests, it was on the same table Maya was watching. They weren't law enforcement, and they weren't federal agents. They were operatives, but not hers. "Bishop," Maya murmured, keeping her voice low. "I've got eyes on two unknowns. They're moving toward the target." "Confirmed," Bishop replied, his tone clipped. "They're not ours. We're trying to identify now. Proceed with caution." Maya's options narrowed instantly. She didn't have time to wait for backup or additional intel. The unknowns were closing in, and every second they got closer was a second too many. She began moving, her steps deliberate but unhurried, maintaining the appearance of a guest while positioning herself for interception. The two operatives reached the table first, one of them leaning down to whisper something to the older man. His calm demeanor faltered, his face tightening as he glanced nervously at the device in his hand. The younger man stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The sound drew the attention of nearby guests, who turned to look, their curiosity momentarily halting the flow of the gala. Maya seized the moment, stepping into the space just as the younger man tried to slip away with the drive. Her hand shot out, gripping his wrist firmly but without outward aggression. To the casual observer, it might have looked like a polite gesture to steady him. "I think you forgot something," she said evenly, her voice low but carrying enough weight to make him freeze in place. His eyes darted to hers, wide with panic, and she could see the realization dawning in his expression. He knew he was caught. "Let go," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Maya interrupted, her grip tightening just enough to let him know she wasn't bluffing. "And so do you. Hand it over." The older man at the table started to rise, but before he could intervene, the two operatives made their move. One of them reached into his jacket, and Maya's instincts screamed at her to act. In a single fluid motion, she released the younger man's wrist and stepped toward the operative, her hand closing around his arm just as he pulled a small firearm from his holster. She twisted sharply, forcing the weapon from his grip and sending it skidding across the floor. The gala erupted into chaos. Guests screamed and scattered, their panic amplifying the tension as they scrambled for cover. The other operative lunged toward Maya, but she was faster. She pivoted, her elbow striking him squarely in the chest and driving the air from his lungs. He staggered back, clutching his ribs, but she didn't give him a chance to recover. With a swift kick, she sent him crashing into the table, overturning glasses and plates as he crumpled to the floor. "Lawson, what's happening?" Bishop's voice demanded in her ear, barely audible over the noise of the crowd. "Hostiles engaged," Maya replied tersely, her focus entirely on the remaining operative, who had recovered his balance and was now circling her like a predator. She could see the fury in his eyes, the realization that she wasn't an ordinary obstacle. But Maya didn't flinch. She had faced far worse. He lunged again, and she met him head-on, her movements precise and controlled. His strikes were fast but uncoordinated, driven by frustration rather than strategy. Maya, by contrast, was a machine, every block, every counter, every strike executed with ruthless efficiency. Within seconds, she had disarmed him and sent him sprawling to the ground beside his partner. The younger man, still clutching the data drive, hesitated on the edge of the chaos, his eyes darting between Maya and the exit. He made a split-second decision, turning to flee, but Maya was already on him. She caught him by the collar, spinning him around and pinning him against the wall. Her hand closed over the drive, prying it from his grasp as he sputtered incoherent protests. "It's over," she said coldly, her voice cutting through his panic like a blade. "You're done." The federal agents who had been observing from the sidelines finally moved in, their presence reasserting control over the scene. They secured the two operatives, who were too battered to resist, and escorted the older man out of the room for questioning. Maya handed the data drive to one of the agents, her expression unreadable. "Secure this," she ordered. "No one touches it until it's delivered directly to headquarters." The agent nodded, taking the drive with careful hands. As the chaos began to subside, Maya turned her attention back to the room. Guests were slowly re-emerging from their hiding places, their expressions a mix of fear and awe. She could feel their eyes on her, but she ignored them. This wasn't about them. Bishop's voice crackled in her ear again. "Nice work, Lawson. You've got a clean extraction. Any injuries?" "Negative," she replied, her tone flat. "Hostiles neutralized. Mission complete." There was a pause on the other end, then a faint chuckle. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." Maya allowed herself a small, fleeting smile before the mask of professionalism slipped back into place. The mission was over, but her work was never truly done. As the agents escorted the detainees out and the hotel staff began to clean up the wreckage, she straightened her jacket and walked calmly toward the exit. She didn't look back. There was no need. Everything that mattered was already behind her, and the road ahead was waiting. The chaos of the gala had dissipated into a tense, muted hum. The scattered glasses, overturned tables, and the lingering fear in the eyes of the guests told the story of what had happened, but no one dared to speak about it openly. The authorities were moving with quiet efficiency, clearing out the remaining suspects while federal agents secured the premises. Maya stood off to the side, her hands in the pockets of her sleek black jacket, watching the aftermath with a sense of detachment. The mission was complete, but the ripples from the night's events were still spreading. Her earpiece crackled with Bishop's voice, low and measured. "All hostiles secured. The package is en route." "Nice work, Lawson." There was a pause, then a hint of amusement. "I assume you're still in one piece." Maya exhaled softly, her eyes scanning the room one last time. "As always," she said. But this was sloppier than it should have been. Ward was a problem. "That much was obvious," Bishop replied, the smirk audible in his voice. "His involvement was unexpected. Someone tipped him off. We're still tracing where his orders came from." Maya's jaw tensed slightly. "You're saying he didn't just stumble into this?" "No," Bishop confirmed. "We pulled his communication logs. There was an anonymous ping to his station just hours before the gala. No official orders, no paper trail, but enough to push him in the right direction. Someone used him to slow you down." Maya let the words sink in, her fingers curling slightly in her pockets. Ward hadn't just been a self-righteous, overcompensating officer. He had been manipulated. A pawn. Someone had played him, counting on his ego and biases to create a distraction. The realization made her stomach tighten, with a cold sense of certainty this wasn't over. She turned slightly, her eyes finding Ward across the room. He was standing near the exit now, his uniform disheveled, his face contorted in barely contained rage. Two of his fellow officers stood beside him, speaking in low, urgent tones, likely advising him to leave before he made things worse. But Ward wasn't leaving. Not yet. He was staring at her, his expression filled with something beyond anger, something darker. A smoldering, wounded fury that spoke of humiliation he would never forget. Maya took a step toward him, slow and deliberate. She could see the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his fingers twitched at his sides as if he wanted to lash out but knew he couldn't. Not now. Not in front of the federal agents who had already made it clear that his authority in this situation was non-existent. "Officer Ward," she said, her tone even, unreadable. "I hope you learned something tonight." His nostrils flared, his hands balling into fists. "You think this is over?" he growled, barely keeping his voice low enough to avoid drawing more attention. "You think you get to walk away from this like it never happened?" Maya tilted her head slightly, studying him as if he were nothing more than an equation to be solved. "I don't think," she said. "I know." Ward's face darkened, his fury barely contained. "You don't get it, do you?" he hissed. "I know your face now. I know your name. You humiliated me in front of my own men, in front of everyone, and people like me. We don't forget." Maya smiled then. It was a slow, deliberate smile that carried no warmth, no amusement, only a quiet, terrifying certainty. "No," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't forget, and that's exactly why you should be afraid." For the first time that night, something flickered in Ward's eyes that wasn't just anger. It was something closer to unease. He opened his mouth to speak, but whatever he had been about to say died in his throat. Maya leaned in slightly, just enough so that only he could hear her next words. "Your career is already over," she murmured. "You just don't know it yet." She pulled back before he could respond, her expression returning to a mask of quiet indifference. Ward's breathing had quickened, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were turning white. But there was nothing he could do. Not here. Not now. Maya turned without another word, her steps steady and unhurried as she left the room. She felt his gaze burning into her back, but she didn't look back. Outside the hotel, the night air was crisp and cool. The flashing lights of squad cars and unmarked government vehicles painted the pavement in shades of red and blue. Maya exhaled slowly, letting the night's tension dissipate from her muscles. The mission had been successful, but the loose ends nagged at her. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, and she pulled it out, glancing at the message that had just come through. "Unknown number, nice work tonight, Agent Lawson. But you already know this isn't over." Maya's grip on the phone tightened slightly. The text was encrypted, the number untraceable. Someone was watching, someone who had been close enough to see everything unfold. She glanced around the street, her sharp eyes scanning for anything out of place, but she saw nothing. Another vibration. "Unknown number, you stopped one problem. But there are more, and they're watching you too." Maya's pulse remained steady, though a cold certainty settled in her chest. She had expected as much. No operation like this ended neatly. There were always more players in the shadows, waiting for their turn. She typed out a response. "Maya, then tell them to be careful. I don't lose." She hit send and slipped the phone back into her pocket. There was no doubt in her mind that she had just become a target. That Ward's interference had been orchestrated by someone who wanted her distracted. But she wasn't afraid. If anything, she was ready. She stepped off the curb and into a waiting black SUV, the door shutting behind her with a solid finality. The vehicle pulled away from the curb, merging into the city traffic like any other car. But inside, Maya's expression remained unreadable, her mind already working through the next steps. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.